Thanks, everybody. And Anton, thanks for your writing and that talk. I think that Anton's work is really important for sort of understanding the moment we're in. He's one of the few people who's really kind of taking seriously this question of populism and what happened in these last 5 years. And for my part, I think on the American side of things, I think we can look at what happened and the achievements that we've made in the last 5 years, which I genuinely do think was a sort of compression of history, right? I think that we've seen a remarkable amount of gains in a very short period of time. So the way I had talked about this before is to say that about a half century of socialist progress had been made in the 5 years of Sandersism. Now, what does that mean, right? A lot of people talk, and you heard Anton mention it somewhat despairingly, a lot of people talk about the Overton window. And, oh, well, Sandersism's chief achievement is that he moved the Overton window. And this is a political idea that sort of dates back to around when libertarianism was first starting up as a political movement in the United States. And the idea was basically that the way to get things done is to sort of bring the edges of political conversation in your direction. So if this is the window and you're over here, you want to move everything such that you're inside the Overton window. And people talk about this as Sanders' big achievement. I'm not sure there's any real value to that. And I'll get into why later in the talk. But I think it's important to note that the achievements of Overton window media framing are very fickle. And voters' opinions can change very quickly about any given topic. And so in one election, you can see huge majorities for a certain issue. And then in the next election, those majorities can evaporate. So in my opinion, we shouldn't be too rosy about the fact that people really like social democratic demands right now, unless we can organize off of it. So that's the first point I want to make. The second thing I want to say is that what I think the Sanders campaign gave us more than anything else was a field experiment and a crash course in mass politics. The past half century or so has seen socialists be completely detached from political practice entirely. Most socialists, numerically, anybody who really was interested in Marxism or socialism or class struggle, they lived in the campuses. They lived in universities. They were academics. They were intellectuals. They were activists. But they certainly weren't engaged in any kind of mass political project. And what the Sanders phenomenon did was it put us right in the center of the most important election in the world, right? The election for the president of the United States of America. And it forced socialists and people who have socialist ideas to engage with ordinary people on a level and on a scale that had never been done before. It also forced us to reckon with what politics really is, which is not this pristine, platonic version of ideas being thrown up and debated and the best ideas coming out the winners, right? What politics is a lot of dirty tricks, lying, and smearing. And despite your best efforts, despite your attempts to really challenge what politics is currently, you have to deal in that environment. And so that crash course taught us that people who are on the progressive left, like Elizabeth Warren, are not going to drop out and endorse Bernie Sanders, even though we all thought that she would, right? And we also learned that the Democratic Party is not going to shoot itself in the foot just to stop Bernie Sanders. They would never put somebody like Biden against Trump. Well, of course they would, right? So these were political lessons that I think we learned in this really short period of time that we hadn't had a chance to learn previously as an American left. And so that reunification of socialist politics with political practice is, to me, the biggest achievement of the Sanders moment, right? Suddenly, socialists are not these curiosities in the campuses indoctrinating the youth. They are a real political group, right? They're a legitimate claim to political action. But we haven't yet unified socialist politics with the working class. And we're going to get into all the challenges to making that happen. So while we've really attached socialism to politics in a national, major, and important institutional way, we haven't attached socialism to the class basis, which it is for, right? The socialist politics is for the working class, but right now it is not of the working class. And I think that's going to be the chief challenge going forward. So after the Sanders phenomenon, the first thing that started happening on the left, which was predictable, and anybody could have seen this because whenever you lose, this happens, immediately things started going haywire, right? On all sides of the political left, a group that had been once disciplined by the rigor of a national election started splintering like crazy, and there were a million different wacky proposals for what we're going to do next. So I want to go through some of those and some of those pitfalls and show what I think are ultimately dead ends for us and things that we need to avoid. So the first is the most obvious, and it's the one that I think we hear a lot about on Twitter, though it's the least popular in any real sense, which is sectarianism or third partyism. And this is the idea that, well, it was clear that we failed utterly to win the presidency of the United States, which means we should go right back to running third-party candidates that get 1% of the vote and spending all of our time, trumpeting X or Y minor candidate because they won a city council seat or because they became dog catcher on a third-party line. To me, it's a dead end no matter what, right? We have a political system, and I think you guys all read the article that I wrote on why third parties are incapable of breaking through, but we have a political system that necessitates the need for a mass constituency if you're going to challenge anything on the level of the major parties. And no third party can actually generate a mass constituency because they're perpetually doomed to spoiling elections and or being, basically curiosities. So voters are never going to really be interested in them. And it's hard to generate a constituency if your basic claim to fame is losing, right? And it's, as I say in the article, it's right there in the name. Third parties are the distant bronze medalists of American politics. And that's how most voters see them. They see them as essentially incapable of influencing politics. So that's one thing I think we need to avoid, third partyism. We also need to avoid subculturalism, which is a retreat back into kind of elite campus culture of sort of obscurantist left-wing politics, philosophical politics, all that kind of stuff, which divorces ourselves from the actual political practice of winning people over to a socialist program. And that kind of politics, I think, was very dominant in the United States among socialists in particular, not necessarily among activists, but among socialists in particular. The creating a kind of subculture was a very important part of maintaining the socialist flame. And I think it's something that we have to avoid. The truth is that if we're going to attract most ordinary people, the majority of working class Americans, we simply can't retreat into enclaves of pure socialism, right? It's a very bad way of attracting new adherents to a political movement, is to look as off-putting as most subcultural movements do. And the third pitfall that I want to warn against is what Anton mentioned, which is called movementism. And movementism is the belief that we have to sort of tail every protest movement, and every protest movement is going to have a spark, and that spark is going to ignite the next big mass movement, and we have to be at the front of it. And this kind of movementism was very popular in the 1990s among activists, and it was basically, a substitute for political practice. It was a way for lonely, I don't mean that psychologically, I mean politically lonely groups of left-wingers to justify their existence, right? You go to a protest, you feel like you've done something, like you've made a stand, you've done all this kind of activism. But as a political practice on a mass, large scale, it's really limited. And it can win some concessions here and there, especially on the very local level with certain congresspersons, et cetera, but it certainly cannot get a majority of people interested in the kind of politics you want them to be interested in. Because social protests work best when they are fighting against a very narrow set of issues. They don't work best when they are articulating a vision for a whole society. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. So these are the three big pitfalls on the left that we have to avoid. These are the left-wing pitfalls. Now, the three pitfalls on the right are electoralism, first and foremost. And this is going to sound weird coming from me because I'm one of the biggest proponents of the left being involved in elections. But I do think there is a danger from some on the left of seeing our prospects as tied up with winning the next election. And if we don't win the next election, then we're failing as an organization and as a movement to build a constituency of the working class. And that logic, that instrumental logic of elections, suggests that if you can't win the next election, then you are failing. But the truth is, and this is something that we have to be aware of, building a constituency takes time. And it takes a lot more than just running candidates for election and ensuring that they do all the right, metrics and they meet all the goals that the existing electoral apparatus says are important. And it means building up institutional strength in the unions. It means building up basic civil society organizations that no longer really exist. And it means doing a lot of the type of campaigning that happens in between elections to build an organization, right? So the challenge with electoralism is it immediately pushes you in a direction of trying to win the next election by any means necessary, right? And that often means watering down your program, seeking out a base that you don't exactly want, right? Like professional, suburban, middle-class whites, which is who are the people who predominantly vote. And it means using metrics and media that aren't exactly how you change politics, right? They are ways of winning elections, certainly, but they're not exactly how you change the debate. And so this leads into the second pitfall on our right, which is the suburban road to social democracy. And this is the kind of vision that I think this guy, Sean McElwee, is most famous for promoting, and Data for Progress, right? And basically what they said was, look, Bernie failed to get the working class on board with his program. He didn't expand the electorate. He wasn't able to actually pull blue-collar workers into his coalition. Those people voted for Biden. Why do we care about them anymore? And McElwee is famous for sort of flagrantly saying we shouldn't care about the working class, right? And the challenge with this is that they actually can win elections. The suburban progressives are going to win more elections than we are. And that's something that's hard to swallow because their task is much easier. They're saying politics is a middle-class person's game. Why bother with those working class people? Let's focus on the suburban professionals, bring them in. After all, those people are probably more liberal than the workers anyway, and we can win a few congressional elections here and there. But there are two major problems with this. One, the first problem with it is the sort of moral abomination of saying, let's give up on 70% of the country. But the second problem with it from a strategic angle is that what they're essentially doing is incapable of actually influencing national politics. Because if you're the Democratic establishment and you look at an ultra blue district, and in an ultra blue district, somebody like Ayanna Pressley is elected, right? And she's elected by largely postgraduate educated, upper middle class, 100K a year salary voters. What interest do you have in changing your appeals, right? Essentially what the Democratic Party looks at and says, great,
Don't get it?
Ayanna Pressley won an election among an ultra blue district that we were never going to lose that election in anyway. Fantastic. And you're saying, you're validating the Democratic establishment strategy of winning among suburban voters, right? The Democratic establishment has been very clear that their entire strategy is to focus on the suburbs and to focus on winning suburban congressional seats. If we say that's our strategy too, guess what? They're going to eat our lunch. They're far better funded. They have more media connections. They're going to win those elections. And if we do win those elections, we have no leverage over them. This is one reason why the blue dog Democrats, who were able to steal Republican seats, had so much more leverage in the party than the AOCs do contemporarily. Because the blue dog Democrats had something over the party head, right? They said, look, we can win elections against Republicans, you guys can't. And so the Democratic Party had to listen to them, and the Democratic Party moved dramatically to the right to listen to them. If we can't win elections, general elections against Republicans, there's absolutely no reason why people should care about socialist politics. So we have to avoid the suburban road to social democracy, which to me is a dead end right off the start. And finally, we have to avoid what we understand from the 1990s as kind of NGO anti-politics. The insistence on charity, on building up nonprofit organizations, and on doing a lot of media work around how bad the system is and how bad things really are. To me, this is fundamentally an anti-political way of operating. People know things are bad. People know that their paychecks haven't been growing. They know that they don't have health care. Constantly exposing it and using various nonprofits to show just how bad it really is doesn't do much from a political perspective. Really what it does is it makes you look weak and whiny. It doesn't make you look like a political leader. It makes you look kind of like a weak set of media liberal, bleeding heart liberals who nobody really wants to be involved in. And that's been the trajectory of the nonprofit liberal sector, with fewer and fewer members involved in that whole world since the 1990s, but more and more cash that they sort of gobble up from the big foundations. And so in terms of the overall pitfalls, we have, to use the song, there are clowns to the left of us who are insisting on third partyism, subculturalism, and movementism. And there are jokers to the right of us who are insisting on winning the immediate next election through suburban politics and big NGOs and charities. So both of these visions, I think, are bad, and we have to avoid them, especially as a socialist left. It's going to be hard to avoid them because those people are going to be on TV more than us, and they're going to be getting a lot more attention than us on Twitter and social media. But I think, nonetheless, we should try to avoid them. Now, I want to move into what are our sort of big structural and instrumental constraints going into the next period. And I think these are threefold. One is ideological, one is organizational, and one is fundamentally political. So the biggest ideological constraint that the socialist left in the United States faces right now is identitarianism or identity politics. And it's the thing that I think the socialist movement needs to move the quickest away from and to get over the quickest. And it's hard. It's a very difficult, sort of tough terrain to get around, right? It's laden with moral language. It is a way of appealing to a certain type of moral sympathy, and being sort of rough on it has really strong consequences, especially if you're in media or in any kind of profession where writing and speaking are important parts of your life. But it's a dead end for us politically, and it's a dead end on a number of levels. I'm not sure if people saw the recent polling around Biden, but the only group of people who care that Biden is a white man are upper class whites that make over $100,000 a year. Every other demographic group, especially blacks and Latinos, couldn't care less that he's a white man. And yet, if you listen to progressive media, this is the single most important thing. This is the single most important thing, that Biden's going to have trouble because he's not a diversity candidate. It's just not true among the actual demographics of the country. It's just, there's no evidence for it whatsoever. But among a certain set of largely white professional class people, this is the most important political issue. And there's a reason for it, right? And the reason for it is because it is a way of displacing class politics. It's a way of displacing the narrative around a working class agenda that's a redistributive agenda, and that insists that, yeah, people are going to have to get, even upper middle class people are going to have to get taxed if we're going to get Medicare for all, right? Yeah, you're going to have to sacrifice some things. And part of that sacrifice for the professional class is being arm in arm in a political movement with somebody that you maybe find distasteful or unfashionable because they don't have a college education, right? And so I think for these reasons, the professional class insists on the identity stuff. They insist on the idea that this is the most important thing, and we have to focus so much on demographics. But again, even in their own vision of this world, the idea behind identity politics is if you can prove to certain demographic sectors that you care about them, you can capture their votes. The largest racial and ethnic minority in this country is Latino voters, right? They're absolutely massive. And one reason why Sanders was criticized really early on for not being open enough on immigration, right? He said he wasn't for open borders, and lots of people in the left-wing media world lost their minds. How dare he say that? He's going to lose every Latino vote. Well, it turns out that in the exit polling among Latino voters, who were Sanders' biggest minority demographic by a long shot, immigration showed up fifth among issues that Latino voters care about. Huge majorities of Latino voters said their number one priority was, and this might shock everybody, healthcare. Number two, jobs. Number three, education. And these are majorities, I'm talking 60, 70% of Latino voters said these are the most important things. Only 25 to 30% of Latinos said immigration was the most important thing in the presidential election. Those Latinos were also the college-educated, high-income Latinos that said immigration was the most important thing. So ideologically, we have to shed this idea that identity politics and the excessive woke sort of signaling that happens in the left media and happens on progressive channels and everything like this is the path to the future. It's simply not. It is a constraint on working class politics. It's actually something that many workers find distasteful and many workers find alienating. And I think we have to get over that idea. And basically, we don't have to do much different than what we used to do. The kind of language that appeals to most people is the kind of things that Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King used to say, which is that you should have Medicare for all, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your creed, regardless of your religion, regardless of where you live, regardless of your job. That kind of inclusive universal language is popular among all people. It's the exclusivist language that gets people into trouble. So this is our first sort of ideological hurdle, is the identity issue. Now, the next hurdle is organizational. And Anton touched on this a bit. The biggest hurdle we have organizationally is that the American working class is fundamentally disorganized. And it is so remarkably disorganized that not only do we have incredibly low union density, but even in our party politics, we're incapable of coming to any sort of consensus, right? So in any organized fashion of the political left, we would have been able to say to Elizabeth Warren, as soon as Iowa wrapped up, you have to drop out. And she would have dropped out. And then there would have been some chance that Sanders could have picked up some more delegates and been more of a viable contender going later into the stages of the presidential campaign. Instead of that, because the progressive movement is totally disorganized, because there's no real working class to discipline it, no organized working class to discipline it, Elizabeth Warren could freelance all she wants, and she could coast her way all the way through Super Tuesday and beyond, and no one could tell her to stop, right? On the flip side of that, you see how well organized the establishment is. They are incredibly well organized, so well organized that they took two very promising candidates and they forced them out of the race as soon as possible in order to consolidate around Joe Biden. So you have the disorganization of the working class on one hand and the hyper-organization of the party elite on the other hand. And this brings us to the third big constraint, which is the political one. And this is fundamentally that the Democratic Party is popular among Democrats, and it's something that we have to deal with. The fact that we don't like the Democratic Party elite doesn't change the fact that the Democratic voters, by and large, prefer their party elite to the Republican Party. Politically, we have to show that we are a better alternative to beating the Republicans than they are, right? And I hope that in the coming years, we can demonstrate that they're incapable of actually challenging Republican rule. But for the most part, most rank and file Democrats are going to side with the party establishment over the insurgency because the insurgency hasn't proved itself. And that's the political challenge that we have to meet. Now, these all sound really difficult to overcome, but I think there are three huge opportunities along these three same axes that we can build on. So the first is the triumph of democratic socialism as an ideological vision. And this cannot be understated because in the United States, following the Cold War, anything with the S word attached to it was a death knell. And yet today, it is a normal way of classifying yourself. It is a normal way of identifying. And that cannot be more important. And I think this is one place where we actually have a leg up over our European friends, is that socialism actually has a meaning to it, right? Populism can really mean a lot of different things, but socialism has a meaning. And ordinary people associate socialism with a particular thing. And that happens to not be the Gulag today. It happens to be Sweden and Norway, right? Now, we may say, oh, that's not quite socialism, it's social democracy, blah, 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 blah. So who cares? The fact is that they're associating socialism with a higher standard of living, a highly organized working class, and a level of planning in the economy that the United States has never, ever had before. And if they are associating it with that positively, that's just an unbelievable level of achievement for us. And I think it's something that we still have yet to grasp how important that is. So ideologically, breaking through as democratic socialists has been a huge boon to us. And we have to take that and run with it. Organizationally, DSA has grown dramatically, and a number of other organizations have grown that have built what I think is not quite a party surrogate, right? We're not there yet. I don't think that we have enough union support. I don't think that we're big enough to call ourselves like a party surrogate. We certainly can't discipline our own candidates, right? But what we have become is a connective tissue for the left. So DSA operates as a sort of nodal organization that can pull in unions, it can pull in community organizations, it can pull in candidates, and act with a strong ideological vision as the organization that is behind much of what made up the progressive movement in the past. That connective tissue hopefully congeals into a really strong muscle, right? And that's organizationally where we can grow, right? If we can build real links, especially with the labor movement, especially with the union movement, build real durable links with the labor movement such that we can become something like a political arm of certain local unions and a political arm of certain local labor federations, we can actually become a much more powerful organization in civil society than the socialist movement has been in 100 years. And I think in the coming 5 years, it will be a test of whether or not we can do that. And then finally, the biggest political opportunity we have is Medicare for all. So as the coronavirus crisis has really sort of destroyed American society, destroyed the American economy, the biggest thing it has shown is that having a totally uncoordinated private healthcare system is absolutely incapable of solving the collective problems of something like a pandemic. And if you have collective problems in public health, which you're always going to have, and they're only going to get worse, then you can't have private solutions. Most Americans see that today. They see it even more now than they did when Bernie was in the race. And I think that politically, our opportunity is to see Medicare for all as a post-corona reform, right? If the Great Depression was able to give us Social Security, right, which came on the backs of decades of labor organizing and all that, then coronavirus could actually give us Medicare for all. Only if we seize that opportunity and take it politically. But it could be the catalyst to get us in a place where we can force Democrats to say, okay, it's time. Okay, it's time that we break with the private insurers who've caused mass death, and we actually institute something like a public healthcare system in this country. And it's a matter of national security at this point, right? You cannot have a private system that is essentially denying care to millions and millions of people just because they can't make enough money off of it. So I think politically, the political opportunity for us right now is still Medicare for all. It is the horizon. It is the most important single political achievement that we can make as leftists right now. All right, so finally, I want to wrap up about the future. And I think that the future is something that, you know, we have some say in, but given our weakness and our size, it's also something that's going to be happening without us. So what I'm really worried about, and I hope all of you in the Q&A can dissuade me from being worried about this, is that right now I see two paths in the Democratic Party opening up for elected congressional officials in particular. And the one path is what we're seeing in Biden, right? And Biden is somebody who is conservative on economic issues, and he's also conservative on cultural issues. He's just conservative. He's essentially a left-wing Republican, right? And the case to be made about Biden in the 2020 primary was that that is the definition of electability. Being a conservative is being electable, right? Now, on the left side of the field, what we've seen open up, which worries me, is that the kind of inheritors of Sandersism are not really very like Sanders. And this is to say that Sanders always had crossover appeal. He was always able to actually win Republican voters and win nonpartisan voters to his agenda. And the main reason why is because, you know, as David Frum sort of aptly identified, he was left, but he wasn't woke, right? He had very strong left-wing views, but he didn't really dabble in what people call the woke culture wars, right? Now, my fear is that the left wing of the Democratic Party right now is left and woke, while the right wing of the Democratic Party is not left and not woke. Well, to me, that means that the Democratic Party isn't going to win any elections. Because if your left-wing political program, if your left-wing economic program is tied with an alienating cultural program, like Elizabeth Warren, for instance, who at one point on the campaign trail insisted that a 9-year-old would have veto power over the Secretary of Education in order to prove that she cared about transgender people, which is just mind-blowingly stupid and out of touch with how ordinary people think about the world. If that's the way that you think the world should operate, you're not going to win any trust among ordinary people, right? And then on the other side of the program, if you're Joe Biden and you're able to, you know, flout all of these woke culture war conventions, but your economic program essentially consists of Obama but worse, you're not going to win working class voters into your coalition. And so these two paths for the Democratic Party, again, going back to McElwee, are both paths for the professional class, right? One path, the woke and left path, is the D-class professionals who are, you know, struggling with their income situation and their class situation. So they're willing to accept a left-wing economic program, but given their elite educations and largely confined to a certain campus culture, they're obsessed with a certain type of rhetorical style that is alienating to most working people. And then the other side is basically their parents, who don't have any conception of what working class life is and just assume that all workers are conservative. And because they are comfortable themselves, don't have any interest in a left-wing redistributive economic program. So they think somebody like Biden appeals to the blue-collar lunch pail type because they imagine that working class people are fundamentally bigots and conservative flag wavers, right? Both of these paths are paths that the Democratic Party is actively pursuing, and both are total dead ends. They're electoral dead ends, they're political dead ends, they're ideological dead ends. And I think we have to be able to see that that division is opening up in the party, and it's a division that we have to somehow avoid, right? We need to strike a path that is able to actually have a left-wing economic program, but speak and have a mainstream appeal, not sound sort of alienating in the way that many of the campus left do. And so finally, I think that the opportunity we have is that there is an emerging political majority of the working class. And this is new. And this is to say that politically, the working class has always been sort of, in this country, has always been all over the map ideologically, right? It's one of the sort of things that political scientists always remark upon. But that's starting to change. And it changed in the 1930s, and it's starting to change again, which is to say that most workers, even though many of them don't vote, they do have a program. And that program looks a lot like Bernie Sanders' program, right? They understand that we cannot continue to have a political organization that is incapable of meeting the needs of most American voters and most American workers. And so that working class majority that is forming politically is something that we have to graft onto, and we have to be a part of, and we have to mold in order for them to see that democratic socialism is a viable political future. So I'll end it there. I'm sure there are lots of questions and condemnations of everything I've said, and hopefully we can get to that in a short bit.